I call the Honourable Kris Faafoi.
Mr Speaker, can I begin my contribution echoing the beginning sentiments of the Honourable Nikki Kay and her contribution in saying that this is a bill that has got to this House at second reading, where I think the Select Committee that was considering it has done a really good job of working across the Select Committee itself to improve this piece of legislation. As the Honourable Nikki Kay said, it's not necessarily perfect for the opposition, but when we're dealing with the issue around tertiary education, I think it's inherent on this House to try and get as much cross-party agreement as we possibly can. There's going to be differences, and to change tack a little bit, obviously the Honourable Nikki Kay made comments around our position on charter schools being ideological. We would throw back to the other side of the House that their position on establishing charter schools was ideological, which I think is credit to our side of the House, which has given a pathway for some of those as they call them, partnership schools, Mr Speaker, to transition over to schools of special character as long as they meet certain criteria. I won't get into too much of that because I think we should focus on this piece of legislation itself before I start getting pulled up. Mr Speaker, there are three themes that I did want to focus on this piece of legislation, again echoing the Honourable Nikki Kay. And the first one that I wanted to speak to was around improving the accountability of tertiary institutes, and I think the one point that the Honourable Tracy Martin made, which I think is a good development, is around the Tertiary Education Commission being able to charge an organisation a fee if it does an investigation into that entity and there has been a breach of a funding condition occurred. I think there's a couple of pretty high-profile cases where this has occurred, Mr Speaker, and to give a tertiary education that is charged with educating young adults in our community the funding to do that, and for find them to have misappropriated that money in any way, Mr Speaker, I guess is a wasted opportunity because that money could have been placed elsewhere. I guess the question is whether it be a public tertiary institution or private, from the industry's point of view, what might control the amount of penalty that might be imposed upon it if they were to have cooked the books. Because in some cases, if the fee was exorbitant, then it may see that tertiary institution be put out of business. I think, though, that the answer within the bill itself is a good one, because within the regulations that can be formed as part of this bill, there is a control on how much of a penalty fee can be charged by the TEC for any breach or misappropriation of the money. I'm just looking at my notes here. Where there is a breach of a funding condition to have occurred, the legislation and new regulation will put constraints on the recovery of funding, and this will include a limit on the proportion of costs that the TEC can recover. The TEC obviously will still be able to bear some of the costs of the investigations. Just want to point out also that these fees can only be charged, Mr Speaker, if the TEC finds that there has been some form of misconduct. Obviously, if they do a serious investigation, and as most of our tertiary institutions have, and we hope, obviously, are above board, then the TEC is going to have to wear the cost for itself. I think that's a good mechanism to ensure we don't get fishing expeditions by the TEC if it doesn't have good grounds to suspect that something is going on. That is not to say, Mr Speaker, that the TEC is doing that. But I think there will be genuine concern around the industry that if they could go out willy-nilly and regardless of whether or not some misconduct has been found, that a fee could be charged. So I think that is a good provision within the bill. One other thing I did want to point out is something that isn't going to be able to be done via this piece of legislation, is for decisions by the council of a tertiary institute to be made by writing. Essentially, if they have a whip around of emails, a council can't make a decision by writing. And I think that is a good thing. I think we have to realise the importance of public meetings of tertiary institutions being open, have open access to the public is a very important thing. And I put that in the context of, let's say, a tertiary education outfit in my electorate, which is Whittier Polytech. It was established about 30 years ago with very much a community focus. It has evolved over time into a bit of a corporate behemoth, but still very much at the community level. The community wants to make sure that that institution is there for the purpose of the community. And I think if the community ever thought that it was getting too far ahead of itself and had the ability to do that by being able to make decisions without having any public scrutiny, by letting members of the public be able to attend its meetings, Mr Speaker, I think there will be some serious concern. So I'm happy for the fact that those meetings will still be able to have public access, and those decisions won't be able to be made by a whip around of emails, which I think is good for community input into those institutions. I understand that the offences, penalties, is going to be increased from 10,000 to 50,000. I think that is a good deterrent for anyone within a tertiary institution for, again, going back to the earlier point I made, cooking the books, which I think is a good development there. I think it also opens the access for the window of an investigation to move wider in terms of the time frame too. That obviously gives the Tertiary Education Commission a lot more time to be able to look into these kinds of issues. But Mr Speaker, I think on the whole we need to congratulate the Select Committee that worked on this piece of legislation, I think, over the Parliament, I think. Yep, over the Parliament, so in the 51st and in this 52nd Parliament, for making this piece of legislation as good as it possibly... Will you want it, Mr McIndoe? Made better by this government. Thank you very much, Mr McIndoe. Because what I think this will increase is the accountability of the sector. You know, the penalties put upon the sector if they're found to have had misconduct, and I think just have to be fair in the tone of my speech. This doesn't happen a lot. But if it does happen, then I guess the ability to... I beg your pardon? But if there is misconduct, the ability to take some action. Obviously, Mr Speaker, I'd just like to point back to some of the points that the Honourable Nikki Kay made in a less conciliatory fashion, and just say I think that the moves that this government has made in the education sector in a very short time in government are very exciting. I think if you want to talk ideology and look at the fact that we've moved to get rid of national standards, moved to give young New Zealanders the chance to have a free first year of tertiary education, is going to be a game changer for many New Zealand families, and a lot of New Zealand families that I think haven't or wouldn't even contemplate the opportunity of going and doing an apprenticeship, going to Polytech and going to university. So I think, Mr Speaker, to have that kind of allegation thrown over to this side of the House, that this is based on ideology, is a little bit, I can't use the word, but it begins with H. Mr Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that there is a supplementary order paper about to be produced as part of this piece of legislation. I did hear my friend Chris Bishop send this to the Select Committee. The committee stage of the House will be the opportunity, Mr Speaker, for those amendments in that SOP to be discussed. But just to finish up, Mr Speaker, this will improve the accountability, improve the public and democratic nature of the likes of open council meetings for tertiary councils. I think that's a good thing, and I commend this bill to the House.
The Honourable